Warning: the following is a work of fiction and not intended for children or other sensitive individuals. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The Ballad of Stormy, Part 4. Stormy couldn't sleep. She was plagued by nightmares, odd noises, and the biting rope at her neck. When the first rays of the sun finally broke over the horizon, Stormy let out a heavy sigh of relief. That had been the worstest night ever in her whole entire life. She hoped that Mommy and Daddy would be home soon. Her belly suddenly cramped. She needed to pee and make poopies. She shifted nervously. She still didn't want to leave the hollow, and she wasn't sure where exactly to make good poopies. There wasn't a litter box under the tree. The cramping in her gut prompted her to figure out a solution. She made sure her babies were safe on her back, and then she anxiously made her way out of the hollow and around the tree. She dug a small hole and did her business, shaking with relief. The sun slowly began to rise, and Stormy took a moment to close her eyes in relief as it warmed her. Her babies weren't nearly large enough for a fluff pile yet, and so she had shivered the whole night. She began to chew the grass and was grateful for the dew as it slated her thirst a tiny bit. She made milkies and fed her babies. Her gray bestest baby first, and then whichever one she grabbed next. She gave the ones who weren't nursing a small bath. For a moment, Stormy was actually content. Then the rope snagged a bit on her fluff around her neck and tugged it free. She winced. She had spent the day in that small cycle, eating, pooping, feeding her babies, and she kept an eye out always for Mommy and Daddy. Surely they'd be back soon, right? Stormy retreated to the hollow reluctantly as the sun hit its peak. Where it had been pleasantly warm before, now it was far too hot and made her thirsty, and the dew had long since dissipated. She had already sipped a small amount that had collected in the divot. She eventually dozed off, exhausted. While she was asleep, up on the highway above the embankment, a car full of teens on their last joyride of the summer blazed past. One of the boys, slightly carsick, threw his container of Chinese takeout out the window, along with his empty drink. It rolled down the embankment and a little ways from where Stormy was sleeping. Behind them, a cop turned on his lights and sirens and pulled off the shoulder to pull them over for speeding and littering. The sirens startled Stormy awake. She looked around. Had Mommy come back? But there was no sign of Mommy. A delicious smell suddenly reached her nose. Stormy sniffed the air, following the smell to the discarded takeout. The container had been knocked open, and the cup lay on its side, lid slightly ajar, ice glittering and melting in the sun. Mommy must have left these nummies for her. She did love her. She did care. Stormy understood now. She just had to figure out why she was a bad Fluffy, and then Mommy and Daddy would save her from the sorry tree. She reached forward to get a bite of the tasty nummies, but the rope choked her.
Stupid rope!
Stormy sat down and pouted. She could hear her babies in the hollow, chirping for milkies. She wanted these nummies, not the grassy nummies. Slowly she stood and turned around, backing up until her back legs bumped against the container. She carefully placed her hoof pad against it, dragging it forward little by little. Finally, she had brought it close enough, and she turned and ate with gusto, tearing into the chow mein.
Tasty scatties. Thank you, Mommy.
Once she was done, she spotted the cup with the ice. She leaned forward, gagging, but managed to grab the lip of the cup in her teeth. She brought it back and lapped at the small puddle of melted water inside. She giggled at the ice as it rattled around on her tongue.
Funny coldies.
She picked the cup up and brought it to the tree, placing it in the divot. Finally satisfied, she returned to the hollow, hugging her babies to comfort them from her long absence, and set to feeding them again. The sun dipped lower and lower, but Stormy, sated and reassured that her mommy was taking care of her when she wasn't looking, fell asleep. Stormy had managed to get a few hours of sleep when her bladder woke her up again. She placed her babies on her back, nervously looking out into the darkness. She didn't want to go poopies in the dark, but she didn't think she could wait until the sun came back. She didn't want to sleep next to her poopies either. Her stomach cramped, prompting her to make a decision.
Hold on, babies. Mama need to make good poopies.
She shuffled hurriedly around the tree, squatting and relieving herself. She sighed, but then a stick snapped in the trees and Stormy bolted, scared. Stormy didn't notice as one of her white unicorn babies fell from her back and onto the grass with a soft plop. She ran as fast as she could around the tree, diving into the nest, terrified. She panted and shivered until the adrenaline waned and she fell asleep. The tiny white unicorn filly shivered and peeped as loud as she could. Where was Mama? She had been safe and warm in her mama's fluff, and suddenly she was in this cold, wet fluff. She shivered harder and chirped. Maybe Mama had gone to get nummies to make milkies again. She began to feel around her, trying to find her brothers and sister so she could at least be warm in the fluff pile. There was sudden movement by her back leggies, and she let out a happy chirp. Mama was back. Except this didn't feel like Mama. Whatever this was smooth and cool to the touch. She wiggled and peeped as it wrapped itself around her slowly. Was it trying to hug her to help keep her warm? What a nice friend. She wrapped her tiny front leggies around a coil of it and hugged it back with a tiny squeeze of her own. Suddenly, her friend hugged her even tighter, and she found the next breath harder to draw. She tried to let her new friend know that they were hugging her too hard, but it didn't seem to understand. It hugged her harder and harder, and she began to cough and wheeze. Her voice, desperate and scared, was barely audible above the gentle night breeze. Before long, the little filly could do nothing but pant and flail her useless little legs. She voided her bowels, and something began to cover her head. She batted at it with her hoovesies weakly, but it covered her, and soon what little air she was getting was gone. She succumbed to the darkness. The corn snake, sated, slithered away,